you can add to this board this kind of mosaic of sorts, whether through image, or if you want to draw something really quickly or doodle something, or if you want to type in words. We just want to get a sense kind of why does this conversation matter to you? Or what did you read? What did you read about it that made you show up today? So if folks want to start doing that as we're waiting for other folks to arrive, that would be amazing.
Recording.
Gotta put it on, yeah.
Okay, hold on. Let me make sure that there is an ad setting on this. I apologize.
$52 participants. My God.
All right, now if you go back to the link, there should be this little red dot at the bottom, the little red plus sign that allows you to add to it. Sorry about that.
So Anuj, the little pink circle plus sign at the bottom right, is that what you're referring to? Right there.
Yep. Yeah.
So y'all can just click on that and then it'll allow you to, there we go.
You can either type, or you can take a photo, or you can post a link to something. So if you see an image online that you want to link to it, you can do that. Cool. So as you see, as you press enter, it will start popping up in the space. So let's take a few more minutes just as we're settling in. And if you submit something, also feel free to look at the screen and see what other people are posting.
Oh.
Cool. I'm going to pass it to Paige in a moment to get things going, but I just want to post the link in the chat one more time in case anybody needs it. I mean, again, this is the link to be able to add to this Padlet. So the question of why does this conversation matter to you? All right, amazing. So thank you to everybody who contributed to that. We are going to take a pause on that and kind of come back to it in a little bit. Just as a welcome to you all, my name's Anuj. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. I'm a restorative justice organizer based in Brooklyn, New York. And yeah, we're really excited for this conversation today. I'm kind of tag teaming it with some folks here to be able to merge these larger conversations of ethics and exploitation and art and the intersection of all of those things. And so we're going to kind of explore that, and also what is a restorative response to that world, and to kind of start embodying those things through some smaller dialogues in the space today. But for now, I want to pass it to Paige, who's going to get us started.
Thanks so much, Anuj. It is so exciting to see such a rich conversation already unfolding. Welcome everyone to our Art and Agency event. My name is Paige Dukes. My pronouns are she, hers, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a communications associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights. We are working for equality, dignity, and justice for people impacted by criminal legal systems in the Deep South. I'm also a core organizer with the Liberatory Memory and Writing Projects, Mourning Our Losses, and Georgia Freedom Letters. And I am a formerly incarcerated woman. I spent all of my 20s in prison here in Georgia, and I got out about 5 years ago. And since my release, I have worked a lot with advocacy orgs, like I mentioned before, and also with my friends on the inside, trying to help them get their work and their writing and their voices out there. And so I have experienced both creating on the inside. I think that starting while I was in prison, I realized that my art and my intellectual life was a way to transcend the prison industrial complex. And so I think that artists working in prison have a unique insight into the work of abolition that we can all learn from. And so I was really excited when I was asked to facilitate a conversation at the Justice Arts Coalition convening over the summer called Art and Agency, where we first held a really just revolutionary conversation where we had people joining the Zoom call from prisons in California and Georgia and across the country to talk about their experience creating art in prison, and the different ways that people, often well-intentioned people who work at organizations that do want to advocate and help people who are creating art in prisons, can do harm unintentionally, and then also some of the more blatantly exploitative practices that are out there, so that we could start to create a resource for people like Jack and all of our network to do this work in a way that is transformative and healing, and start to repair some of those harms, and to work together with the people who are closest to the problems and who are most capable of guiding us towards the solutions. So I'm going to introduce our Art and Agency team, many of whom are on the call tonight. Our team, as if somebody would put the link in the chat to our Art and Agency page on the Justice Arts Coalition website, you can see all of the artist bios. But our full team is myself and Amy Wisman and Kamisha Thomas, who are with the Returning Artists Guild in Ohio. If you guys would introduce yourselves and your work.
All right, it's me. I thought it was going to be Kamisha, but it's me. Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Wisman. I am primarily a visual artist. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio. Since I've been released, I've been working on advocacy in one form or another, and I'm really passionate about this conversation because it is a part of sort of my daily life, being an artist and trying to still navigate that world and have people do press about me and stuff, which is why I dropped the image into that initial chat. Kamisha and I co-founded the Returning Artists Guild when we came home, and essentially it was an extension of the community that we had built inside. We knew the power of the arts and what that means for women especially. And so that's kind of like where we started, and we've been working with artists ever since. And I'll let Kamisha introduce herself. And
Thank you, Amy. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, so I am Kamisha Thomas, co-founder of the Returning Artists Guild. My primary medium is film, it's storytelling, and I also paint a little bit. Amy taught me everything I know about painting. It is a pleasure and an honor to be involved in this project. I think it's super important. I did not have a terrible experience with my artwork in prison, but I know that some people did have a totally different experience than I did. And it's important for me to do what I can to help others have a more similar experience like I did, which was fantastic. So that's why I'm here, ready to listen and learn and ingest all of the ideas so that we can implement them into our final document.
Thank you, Amy and Kamisha. The other artists on our team are Carla Simmons, EJ Joyner, Kenneth Reams, William Livingston, Brett Gonzalez, and Spoon Jackson. And as I mentioned, you can read more about them and their bios and their work on the Justice Arts Coalition site. And Carol Alden is on this call, which is why I want to let you introduce yourself if you're here. Carol, are you here? No? Okay.
There you go.
Oh,
Okay, can you hear me?
yeah, we hear you. Glad you're here.
Okay. I'm driving, so it keeps turning off, but let's see if I can get my video going. Nope, guess not. Okay, well, my name's Carol Alden, and I'm also an artist who's been impacted by the system. I was one of the people that had a horrible experience with artwork while there. And I got out about 2.5 years ago, almost 3. It'll be 3 late this spring. And out in the desert trying to carve out a space
Uh-oh, we might be losing you, Carol.
for women, especially art and trauma. So here, unless you hear me now.
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay. There's nothing out here for people like us, especially in Utah. We're thrown away. So I'm trying to create a space for women like us to come to, or anybody for that matter, who's dealing with trauma and wants to heal through art.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know that there are probably a lot more formerly incarcerated artists on this call, and I would love to hear from you about your work and your input in this conversation. One thing that was that I mentioned at the very first conversation was that in prison, our labor is exploited, and so are our creative skills often. Like I was able to access guitars because I worked as a church musician, right? So I was playing this music that maybe I wouldn't have chosen, but it gave me this all important access to instruments that I hadn't had in years. And so, all the different ways that we do what we can to create the art that we need to. I mean, even if it's just a pen on paper or colored pencils or whatever you can get your hands on, really contributes to just the innovation that we had to create for ourselves. And that innovation is something that I think we need in this project, right? We need to find ways because there are so many chilling aspects. We're working within a system that wants to stifle and surveil people's communications. And so even though often we do have well intentions, I'm now experiencing this on the outside, and I find myself changing the way that I tell my story because I realize that a lot of the ways that I started telling my story were influenced by institutionalized language and a sort of learned inferiority. that now, I want to make sure that I don't contribute to that and that I give people empowering ways to share their stories. And when I give people platforms, I also feel the urge to protect them. In my work, a lot of times I connect people with the media, and retaliation is real. I've had people retaliated against because they gave a quote to a reporter. And so I have to navigate the experience of not wanting to chill that person's connection with a reporter, but also like wanting them to not, feel scared that if they speak to someone that they're going to be retaliated against. So these are just all of the really terrible realities that we don't always understand as people who are working on the outside, and that we need people on the inside to explain to us and to help us navigate. One artist that is here tonight that I would really like to introduce is Asia Johnson. If you would tell us a little bit about your work and your experience now navigating working from the outside with women who are on the inside.
Hi, everybody. So nice to be here sharing space with all of you. Wait, can you hear me? Okay. So I spent 7.5 years in Michigan's only prison for women, Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility. I've been home now for 3 years and a few months. I work for the Bail Project, which is a national nonprofit that aims to end mass incarceration by paying bail for people who can't afford it. I started off as a bail disruptor in Detroit, and now I live in Los Angeles, where I am the communications associate. When I first came home, I became a right of return fellow, which is a fellowship. And if there are any formerly incarcerated artists on this call, I'm sure there are, go apply, submit. I think the deadline has been extended through the 23rd, but it is a $20,000 grant that they give you to basically use your art to address mass incarceration. And so it's $10,000 unrestricted for us, and then $10,000 for your project. And so I had just come home, and so I'm like, $10,000, that is like $1 million. And I am going to Steven Spielberg some film, and it's going to be epic. And then I quickly learned that $10,000 was not a lot of money, but I did produce, direct, and wrote a film that addresses women's experiences in prison, and every woman in the film is formerly incarcerated. I spent time with each and every one of those women. And if you want the link to the film, feel free to let me know. I can also drop it in the chat after this. But one of the women inside was one of my very dear friends. I looked at her and she looked at me. She called me her big Black sister. And she actually passed away 2 months after we filmed from a heroin overdose. And just thinking about how readily available drugs are inside. And I want art to be just as accessible as the needle or as Suboxone, or as I don't want those things to exist. I want art to exist. For as long as prisons are here, we need to have these programs. We need to have Shakespeare and all of these different things that give us voice, because the system attempts to strip us of our dignity, our talent. And then when we do showcase our talent, like Paige said, it is exploited. So I am also a Brennan Center for Justice Fellow, and I am doing a project. I'm writing a book, but I'm also working with Brennan Center to interview women across the country about their experience. And I'm very passionate about the trauma to prison pipeline, and really showing how early childhood experiences, teen experiences, toxic relationships, a lost parent, these things shape who we are and shape how we behave and shape the mistakes that we may make. And it's not just that we woke up one day and thought we want to make this huge mistake that's going to land us in prison, for those of us who did make mistakes. It is about our childhood and growing up, and how our parents helped protect us, or maybe didn't protect us or couldn't protect us. And so I have been interviewing women, and there are some states that I have not been able to connect with. So if anybody knows of an incarcerated woman who would like to participate, I fought really hard to get the women paid, because sharing the most vulnerable parts of ourselves is not easy, and no one should do that for free. And so we are able to pay $250 to the women for speaking to me. And I share my story too. So it's not a one-way street. I don't want any woman to think that I'm coming in and hacking them or, just taking from them. I share, bits and pieces of myself too, because I've been in their shoes for a long time. I was in their shoes. And also to shine a light on all the possibilities, because I remember when I was inside, I lost hope. I didn't know what life was going to look like after I came home. And I thought it was going to be nothing but darkness. And so I share so much because I want people to see that spaces like this exist. And there are other spaces that exist that are willing to put us where we belong, where our talents lend themselves to. So thank you again for having me. I remember meeting Amy in California like a couple years ago, and thank you to everybody. I reached out via email maybe a couple months ago, but during those couple months I was fighting hard to get this $250 for the women, and now that I'm able to do that, I am ready to get this ball rolling. So again, if anybody, my email, I can drop my email in the chat, and also if you know anybody who's incarcerated in our nation's jails, the Bail Project is always here, willing and ready to assist. So again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Asia, for all of that amazing work that you're doing, for sharing about it. I'm so glad that you're here to join this conversation. After we were able to continue this project, and we have really had to think about pulling in people who are currently in prison at every step of the way and making sure that they have all of the resources that we have when we're doing this work. And, especially in research, a lot of times people in prison are considered a protected class, and we considered the ethics are considered without consulting them. And so, nothing about us without us has really informed this whole project from the start. And we're really glad to invite Jack's entire network of artists into this conversation. And so we're going to do some breakout sessions with myself, Amy, and Kamisha will be in facilitating, but we also invite everybody to share your experiences. And so now I'm going to kick it back to Anuj so you can lead us through this first exercise and this question about restorative justice and its role in this work, because it's not just about the harm, right? We want this project to be a healing and transformative project.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, it's interesting because we have an hour and a half to spend together today, which is kind of just touching on some of the basics of this larger conversation and kind of building more community around it with one another, so that we can kind of make our way in flow to this examination of well, how do we respond to harm when it does arise? How do we respond to exploitation when it does arise? And so one of the things that we're really going to be focusing on today in conversation is when we talk about the exploitation of art, what do we mean? How do we know that it's happening? When we talk about the ethical treatment of art, non-exploitive practices, what do we really mean by those things, right? And I think that even the act of really creating a shared vocabulary and a shared understanding of what we mean, it's helpful in a couple of ways. I think, first of all, it allows us to build solidarity in the movement of being able to protect artists and to be able to protect artists who are incarcerated. And also, it better equips us as community members to be able to navigate instances of harm when they do arise, to be able to have conversations around that when they do come up. And so rather than a focus on what is restorative justice, we're mostly going to be exploring some of these themes through smaller group dialogue to kind of build out that conversation. But before we do that, I wanted to do a couple things. First and foremost, I want to share the Padlet again. And the question that I have for you all, first of all, if you want to keep adding to it, feel free to. But really the question that I have for folks, and either you can respond in the chat, or if you want to come off mic and just jump in, is where are you finding alignment with other responses that are coming up? Where are you finding challenge or tension? What questions are coming up for you? What feelings and thoughts are coming up for you? So I just want to share this again. And I can also put the link in the chat one more time so that people can scroll through it on your own as well. But for whoever wants to jump in, as you look at this community of answers as to why this conversation matters to you, where are you finding alignment? Where are you finding challenge? What's coming up for you? I would love to hear from a few folks.
I can hop in. I think for me, Kate, our Connect with Jack. Nice to see everybody. Right off the bat, I mean, in grander perspectives, like I think I'm really interested in focusing on abolition, but you know, I had a conversation with people last night and they had never heard of what happened they had never heard of the Attica riots and they had never heard of the story of Emmett Till. And it was just like such a reminder that these things are not in the kind of regular purview and the regular conversations with people. And I think for me, because I guess I would say I'm so like entrenched in this work and I do it every day. I write about this and so I go to school for. I think sometimes it's really easy to forget that kind of the common person, the everyday person doesn't really know these histories. So I'm just really fortunate to be in this space and to kind of like have a place to talk about these issues, but then remember how important it is to bring them back into our communities and really kind of like elevate these stories and not just bring them into kind of these little niches. So really nice to share these conversations.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And specifically the idea of like how history continues to impact our like analysis in this moment, right? I think ethics are often informed greatly by an awareness of history and how it impacts the present. Any other things that people want to name in terms of alignments, questions as they look at these responses? It sounds, I guess one of the things that's coming up for me is that people are asking themselves the question of like, well, how do I know that what I'm doing isn't exploitive? And so I think that's super, I mean, that's a super essential question to be asking the self is like, I want to do this work and I don't want to do it in a way that ends up exploiting people. So that seems to be like a little bit of a commonality across the space. Cool. So we'll continue to put this link in the chat. Again, this conversation is able to grow to mean different things to you. And so if there are things down the line that you want to add to it of like, okay, maybe at the end of the conversation, it's relevant for a different reason, you can come back and keep reflecting in this space. So one of the things that also stands out to me about the responses is that we have folks in the space who are directly impacted by our criminal legal system. We have folks in the space who are formally incarcerated. We have folks in the space who aren't, who are all going to start working in this space to hold some of these questions together around ethics and exploitation. And so before we go into small groups, I just wanted to open it up to all of you to kind of get a sense of what community agreements you would like to abide by as we are in our smaller groups. And I know that oftentimes community agreements are just as a framework of like how we treat one another when we are with one another sharing space. But what I really would guide people to think about is like, we, as it stands, do not have a world of non-exploitive practices or where people are treated humanely and with dignity and ethically, you know? And so if we're starting to create a version of that world here together, what are the ways we need to treat one another? You know, like how do we start building that world right here, right now? And so, okay, so a couple that are coming up in the chat. So lifting up the voices of those who often are voiceless because of our flawed system, or those who aren't given an opportunity to use their voice within the system. The idea of using I statements and not speaking for others. And you can either type in the chat or come on the mic and contribute.
I'll share one tool that's been really useful for me that I learned from another formerly incarcerated person, which was the tools ouch and oops. One thing that came up in our very first conversation was about language and the way that people in prison are labeled, and therefore their work is all similarly labeled and devalued. So language justice is a huge part of my work, and I'm now using this term to give people using these tools to help people give themselves grace, right? So if I hear somebody calling people who are in prison by a derogatory term, I'll say, ouch, you know, and I'll say it out loud to make people be like, wait, why? And then hopefully the next time that they go to use that programmed language that is like intentionally programmed into our consciousness, you know, maybe they'll say, oops, and try a different term.
Cool. I tried to capture that in the chat page. Yeah, thanks so much for that. So also this idea that like when you say oops or ouch, that's like a moment that's able to open up conversation to kind of shift our language norms. So a few others offer content and trigger warnings, or maybe the idea of like if you're about to share a story and know that it and want a name before that it contains certain material, feeling free to do that. Assuming positive intent and having a willingness to receive feedback. Commenting on our own experiences rather than somebody else's, mindfulness of language, a willingness to ask the wrong questions. Another way that I've heard this lately that I really like is like speaking in draft, like speaking from a place of curiosity and like knowing that the language you use can change. And we have listened deeply. Recognizing whatever privileges you hold and being able to center narratives. Yeah, thank you all for all of these. This is a great list. Yeah, and so this last comment that came into the chat, I think there's this idea of like, we're holding a lot of different relationships to the impact of incarceration in this space, right? And I think that in general is just something to be so mindful of as we're talking with one another, is that we all do have really different relationships to this work and different answers to this question of, well, why are we showing up to it today? Amazing. So does anybody have any last things that they would want to add to that list? Great. So we're going to go into our first small group. How this is going to work is there's going to be folks in each small group who are kind of facilitating the conversation, specifically the folks that you were introduced to just about 10 minutes ago. And we're going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes in these small groups just exploring a question together, and then coming back and just having a little bit of a reflection before going out into the next group. One of these questions, so these questions are really intended, again, to really build conversation around like, what do we mean when we talk about ethical practice and non-exploitive practice, so that we in future conversations can get kind of more narrow in terms of focusing on how we might respond to specific incidents of harm. So this first question is, what are ethical questions that arise for you, within you, as you engage with work that includes or involves the art of those impacted by the prison system? And so really, as you read about what this session was like, as you think about your own work, really what this initial space is saying, what are the questions or tensions that are on your mind, right? And one of the values of being able to start in exploring that way is that I think I understand a huge part of my own artistic practice to be able to take some of the private or quieter questions that weigh heavy as an individual and say, can we hold these collectively? Are other people thinking about them as well? What happens when we decide to answer them together rather than in silos? So hopefully this first small group is really a space to be able to start naming some of the questions and tensions that are coming up for you. Before we go into those groups, does anybody have any questions? Amazing. So feel free to launch us into our breakout rooms, and I'll send a message in about 15 minutes for people to come back. Cool. I told Paige that I would stay in the main room in case folks need things in the interim and to be able to send stuff out to communicate.
So in room 1, it's Amy with Alden as note taker. And in room 2, it's Carol with Catherine as note taker. Room 3, it's Kamisha with Ian as the note taker. And I'm going to join that room too. And
Okay.
room 4 is Paige with Robin.
Amazing.
Cool.
Cool.
So you said you're going into room 2?
I'm going into room 3 with Kamisha.
Okay, I'm going to go in room 2 because I'm worried that Carol from her phone isn't really going to be able to participate much.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, can you, let's get whoever's, hanging here situated. So I'm going over to 2.
So
So for the folks who are still in this room, so Lori and Efrain and Selena, you should have like an invitation to join a small group that popped up on your screen. So you just need to select into that.
So for Lori, it is room 1. And then Ephraim, you are in room 3. They might just be having trouble with connection.
Yeah, no worries. I think because, because Efrain just came back.
Right.
Okay. Okay, Andy, if you want to join one of the groups, because I have co-host, I can add people as they come in, if that's helpful.
Perfect. Thank you.
Of course. Hi, Crystal. I see you're just arriving. I'm going to send you to one of our small groups, if that's okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. All right, welcome back, everybody. Apologies because I assume that the 60-second room cut off some conversations that were going on, and I apologize for that. I would love to hear back from some of the small groups if anybody wants to share out just on like what are some of the big points that were really coming up in your small groups. Whoever wants to kick us off can feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll start. We did some introductions. I wanted to kind of get a feel for who I was speaking with in the room, just to get a better idea and so that we can understand each other a little better. So we didn't really get to the question in full. However, I wanted to kind of build on that question and add to it, like, for those who have been directly involved with working with artists who are incarcerated, what weight or how much did the institution itself play on your ethical concerns versus the artists that you were dealing with? Because I think that in large part, having dealt with volunteers and in an institution, it's the barriers come from the institution, not so much from the artists themselves. So I was just trying to get a feel for how that factored into your ethical questions and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship of institutions has to be a part of that conversation of ethics. I think namely because when we talk about ethics, we're often talking about dynamics of both harm and healing. And there's a lot of work that happens within institutions that are impacting how you and I experience our relationship or experience hurt or experience healing between ourselves. And so it's like an examination or a reevaluation of the institutions, of the orgs, kind of also lets us gain a completely new perspective on how we are relating to each other. Thanks so much for that. I would love to hear what else was coming up from folks, if anybody wants to share out from the other groups.
I've got something to say. What Kamisha was talking about as far as the institutions being involved, I mean, that was a huge part for us. We weren't allowed to do art for ourselves, but we were assigned to do art for the officers as far as the buildings, and when they wanted to promote something to the public, they'd bring tours through, and so we'd have to go and pretty everything up with murals, which would be promptly painted over, not too much longer after that. But if we're not allowed to do art for ourselves and our families, we still jumped at the opportunity to do art, any kind of art. We wanted any kind of expression. But because of this experience, this is part of I'm the director of the Desert Fish House Hope and Healing Project. And I specifically want to elevate the work that women come and do for healing purposes. And I want to aggressively pursue exhibits around the country or worldwide with the work that we do with women, and and any other people. I mean, we're going to branch out, but I'm starting out with women who've experienced domestic violence and incarceration. But I think it's so critical for these voices to be put forward and for people to be compensated and for people, like I say, to be elevated and not feel like we're just required to do things for free in order to have any visibility at all or any opportunity to do something.
We didn't get past introductions in my group, but we did kind of go through what I think about as a framework for thinking about ethical questions around this topic. So questions that could fall under access or finances or autonomy or language or narrative. Just a lot of stuff, but my brain has to have like a filing system to think about all of the overlaps, especially when thinking about artists who are still inside versus artists who have returned. And the complexity of that is similar to kind of the additional complexity of the institution, except society is the institution, or probation, parole, et cetera. So just kind of like laying out a framework to think about how we move forward.
Paige, you are currently on mute.
Thank
and
you.
also, Amy, would you be able to put those categories that you just named in the chat? Thanks so much.
We had such a rich conversation, and just so many people were questioning their own practices. And a couple of things that came up was like what it means to put your work on social media. Like, I know that like when I was in prison, I had no concept of social media because it didn't exist when I went in. And so it's hard to know that that's how someone wants to share their work when they don't they have no actual access to see how it would work and who would be able to access it and share it. And also something that came up about like, do we need to be changing our practices around like being extractive? Like, where are we seeking out these stories? Or are people actually wanting to share their stories and their work in this way? Or maybe we're only giving people an opportunity to share their work if they're also sharing their story, and they might not want to assign the stigma that society would label their art with, like quote unquote prison art, which is also something that came up in our very first conversation, was just how that can be double-sided. It could be either devalue someone's work in the way that they are devalued as a quote unquote prison artist, or it could be a gimmick where people try to, use the term to market their work. And we need to go ahead and get into the second question. So we want to get into the very specific, both harms and best practices, some things that have come up so far. And I just want to thank everyone for contributing to this, because like we are taking notes, and this is all going into the practice of creating this this guide that we are working towards, this resource. So it can be, like I said, anywhere from well-intentioned people like wanting to share your art and having to navigate systems that don't want people to express themselves, or don't want them to get paid for sharing their work. But then there's also some like really intentionally and blatantly bad practices, like people who will expect you to sign a contract that you don't really have a choice when you are working. Like here in Georgia, people don't get paid for their work. So if I'm working for a 40-hour week and I get an offer, like it's very hard for me to decline a contract because it's not ideal and because it's exploitative, or right, straight up steal your work. A lot of times people have to put watermarks on their work, but how do you do that if you're in prison, or if you don't have someone that you can trust to put that watermark on your work? And then don't get me started on NFTs, because I'm still in a way technologically crippled as a millennial who spent 10 years in prison and like trying to catch up. And like, I can't even really wrap my head around all of the ways that people's works shared with like no opportunity to copyright it or to have any licensing over it. So I will let us get back into our group so we can dig deeper into these specific harms and best practices.
Yeah, amazing. So the phrasing of the question is, are there specific practices that you engage with that you can recognize as ethical, that you recognize as unethical, and what are they? So this is really a practice exchange that we can get into some specifics. So I will drop that in the chat, and then we can open up the breakout rooms again. Hi, Mike. You're the only one back from your group.
I'm fast.
Got it. Where in the world are you?
Oh, Chicago.
Oh, nice. What part of Chicago?
I just on the edge, northern edge. I'm in Evanston.
Okay, cool. I was born in the suburbs in Romeoville.
No kidding. Did you ever live in the area?
I lived in Bolingbrook for a while, and then I moved to Cleveland when I was a toddler.
Oh, geez. Okay. Where are you now?
In Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, that's right.
Yeah. All right, welcome back, everybody. So here's the thing about this hour and a half together is that we both had wanted it to be so dialogue based, and there's so many of us. So I hope you pardon our tension between those spaces, right? And just knowing that there's so much in this conversation that I think is going to trickle into the next one. I would love to hear what some folks have in reflection from those small groups. If anybody from those small groups want to share out. Things that came up or stuff that you're left thinking about.
Hello. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, this is really quick, but I think we should add one more thing to that list that Amy worked up, and that is censorship, because that's an important piece. Especially when dealing with institutions and as far as like being ethical, because we think that, an even playing field is more ethical than, like censorship.
Thanks, Kamisha. And Tyra, passing it back to you.
Hello, team. We were in our group and we thought about like an appraiser going inside, like maybe we had a philanthropist to go inside the prisons where there are artists that are screaming out to know their worth, to go inside and praise their work so that they will really know what their work is worth. Because we were talking about how the same institutions that are trying to help us is also hurting us by exploiting us.
And then kind of building off that, one of the things that we're really kind of developing is this notion that there really isn't any ethical systems to kind of compare to. I know Sarah Marie like pointed out that like the art world, we can just think about like MoMA, is an example of like really problematic ethical decisions and, actions. So the most important part is then us carrying it forth. Okay, so if there is no ethical models, then whose responsibility is it? Well, then it becomes like individuals like us and organizations like us and branches and tangents and the end systems impacted people to kind of stand up and say and demand that we have these that we create these ethical models. And obviously that's easier said than done, but I think that that's really the only challenge. And I mean, unless we start to create these kind of standards across the board, then no like true advancement can happen, like as sustainable advances. So I think that that's one of the most important things.
There's this question that's coming up for me of like, when you see a piece of art, like, what does that mean to you? Or like, what is that to you? And I think one of the things that gets tricky in the ethics conversation is that there are entire professional fields that are run and facilitated off of seeing art as capital, as seeing art as an opportunity. And so it's like, how do we actually shift those conversations to like all of the other things that we see that we see art to be? Yeah. Anything else? Any other reflections that people want to share?
Oh yeah, for sure. Treka asked if I could reiterate something, and that was just my initial conflict with arriving to doing this work post-release was just that I had to realize that either my work was strengthening institutions or my work was hastening abolition. And that likely it was on some kind of spectrum, and some things were here and some things were there, but that that is kind of the central conflict in engaging, especially if you're working directly with institutions, is just that your work is probably strengthening that institution. And so that is a part of my sort of like overarching framework for how I approach this and try to create ethics for myself, at least, around something that I think is totally unethical. So yeah, that's the conflict.
Yeah, there's like a phrasing of that question that came up in my mind of how does art created within the system serve as an abolitionist tool? Is it able to? How is it able to? Really appreciate that question. So we only have a few minutes left. And because of that, Paige, I feel inclined to pass it to you in closing. I think just to kind of plant some seeds for a map ahead, there's a lot of hopes that we had coming into this conversation. And I know that it also needs like breath and pace and rhythm. And so with that being said, like just to share one of our final questions that we wanted to have time to dive into is like, how do you define the non-exploitive treatment of art? Right. And so that's kind of this first question of, if now we're like sharing questions that are on our mind about it and best practices, like what does it actually mean on a very human level to be non-exploitive or non-exploitative? And yes, yeah, so our hope is that this will be a continued conversation. And then the next part of that conversation is like, through a restorative lens, what does interruption of exploitative practices look like? What does it look like when it comes from the community, by the community, for the community? So those are kind of our next like steps to go and moves within this conversation. But Paige, I will pass it to you. And also I'm just like kind of caught off guard by how quickly 90 minutes just passed. But yeah.
Yes, thank you, Anuj, and thank you to everyone for this amazing conversation and for being a part of this project. And yes, we will have another event in 2 weeks where we will continue this conversation, and we hope that you can join us again, because I think challenging our own ethics in the way that we are all doing here is like leading us to a very strong communal ethic. Thanks, Anuj, and I would love for us to all think on this third question that we didn't get to talk about in our breakout groups, so that we can continue the conversation in 2 weeks. Thanks to everyone else who is helping me facilitate this conversation, and to everybody who's contributed. It means so much to us and to our whole team. And this resource, this guide, this code of ethics that we are creating will be a living document, and will be a thing that is informed by everybody who is doing the work. So thank you for being a part of it.
Wendy, hello.
So, hello. Hey.
Right.
Tyra is so beautiful. And I was in the Rife the other day, and this lady was like, oh, I painted this woman and she's so blah, blah, blah. And I was like, who are you talking about? Who did you paint? Oh, you painted one of my closest friends. Okay, cool. Good for you. Congrats. You've arrived. I got to get off of here. Live once ice cream cone. I just want to say
bye, team. See you in 2 weeks, guys.
Bye.
Peace. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a safe night.
Thank you. Good night.